Hello everyone, and welcome back to Dreadful Corner. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. Graymore House was a place I had tried to forget for nearly 2 decades. It was the kind of house that was spoken about in hushed tones, the kind you'd drive past quickly, avoiding eye contact with its shadowy windows. Nestled deep in the woods, far from the nearest town, the Victorian mansion had a dark history that lingered in the minds of those who knew of it. My childhood was spent within its walls, and the memories of that time have haunted me ever since. I inherited Graymore from my grandparents when I was only 6 years old. They died under mysterious circumstances, found together in the parlor, pale and cold, with no apparent cause of death. My parents were devastated, but for reasons they never explained, they chose to move into Graymore rather than sell it. My father insisted it was the right thing to do, to keep the house in the family. My mother, on the other hand, seemed terrified, her gaze always lingering on the shadows in the corners of the rooms. As a child, I didn't understand the gravity of the situation. The house was a maze of corridors, secret passages, and hidden rooms, a perfect playground for a curious boy. I spent countless hours exploring every nook and cranny, convinced that I could uncover the secrets my grandparents had left behind. But Graymore was no ordinary house, and the more I explored, the more I began to feel like I wasn't alone. It started with the whispers. I'd be playing in one of the many rooms, and suddenly I'd hear a soft voice, so faint it was almost imperceptible. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the whispers persisted. They were always just out of reach, echoing through the halls, drawing me toward the darker, more secluded parts of the house. When I told my parents about the voices, they brushed it off as childish fantasies. My father, a practical man, assured me it was just the wind or the creaking of the old house. My mother, however, seemed unnerved by my stories, her face growing pale whenever I mentioned the whispers. The first real encounter happened one cold winter night. I was lying in bed trying to sleep when I felt a chill in the room, far colder than the rest of the house. My breath came out in white puffs, and I pulled the blankets tighter around me. That's when I heard it, a distinct voice, clear as day, calling my name. William. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a woman's voice, soft and sorrowful, coming from just outside my bedroom door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to call for my parents, but fear held me in place. The voice called again, this time more insistent. William, come to me. I slowly got out of bed, my legs shaking, and crept toward the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct screaming at me to stay in the safety of my room. But something compelled me to open the door. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the full moon shining through the tall windows at the far end. The voice called again, and I saw a figure standing in the shadows at the end of the hall. It was a woman, dressed in a long, flowing gown, her face obscured by darkness. She turned and walked slowly down the hall, disappearing around the corner. I followed her, unable to resist, my bare feet cold on the wooden floor. As I rounded the corner, I saw her again, standing in front of a door that I had never noticed before. It was a large, ornate door, covered in intricate carvings that seemed to move in the flickering light. The woman turned to me, her face still hidden, and opened the door. Beyond the door was a staircase, spiraling down into darkness. The woman descended the stairs, and I followed, my fear mingling with curiosity. The further down we went, the colder it became, until the air was thick with frost. My breath came out in ragged gasps as I tried to keep up with the woman, who seemed to glide effortlessly down the stairs. Finally, we reached the bottom, and the staircase opened into a large, circular chamber. The walls were lined with ancient bookshelves, filled with dusty tomes and strange artifacts. In the center of the room was a stone altar, and upon it lay a book bound in what looked like black leather. The woman stood by the altar, her back to me, her head bowed as if in prayer. I approached the altar, my eyes drawn to the book. There was something about it that filled me with a deep sense of dread, but I couldn't look away. As I reached out to touch it, the woman turned to face me. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes hollow and black as the void. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and she spoke in a voice that echoed through the chamber. "William, you have come at last." I screamed and backed away, tripping over my own feet and falling to the cold stone floor. The woman laughed, a terrible, hollow sound that reverberated off the walls. I scrambled to my feet and ran up the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears. The cold seemed to follow me, and I could hear the woman's laughter echoing up the stairwell. When I finally reached the top, the door slammed shut behind me, and the warmth of the house returned. I ran to my parents' room, tears streaming down my face, and pounded on the door until my father opened it. He took one look at me and knew something was wrong. After that night, things changed in Graymore House. The whispers became louder, the shadows darker. My mother grew more distant, spending hours staring out the window, her eyes glazed over as if in a trance. My father tried to keep the family together, but I could see the strain in his eyes. He spent more and more time away from home, working late into the night, leaving my mother and me alone in the house. The nightmares began soon after. I would dream of the woman in the gown, standing at the foot of my bed, her hollow eyes staring into mine. In my dreams, she would reach out to me, her cold fingers brushing against my skin, and I would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat. My parents took me to a doctor who prescribed sleeping pills and told them I was just a child with an overactive imagination. But I knew better. I knew she was real. One night, I woke to find myself standing in the hallway, my hand on the doorknob of that strange door. I had no memory of getting out of bed, and the realization filled me with a cold dread. The door was slightly ajar, and the familiar cold air seeped out from the stairwell beyond. I slammed the door shut and ran back to my room, but the feeling of being watched never left me. The next morning, I found scratches on the inside of my bedroom door, as if something had been trying to get in. My parents dismissed it as my imagination, but I knew the truth. The house was alive, and it wanted me. As the years passed, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Objects would move on their own, doors would open and close by themselves, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. My mother's health deteriorated rapidly, her once vibrant spirit replaced by a hollow shell of a woman who barely spoke or ate. My father grew more desperate, turning to alcohol to drown out the horrors of the house. But nothing could silence the whispers. Then, one night, everything came to a head. I was 13 years old, sitting in the library with my father, when we heard a loud crash from upstairs. We both froze, the blood draining from my father's face. He grabbed a poker from the fireplace and motioned for me to stay behind him, as we cautiously made our way upstairs. The noise had come from my parents' bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and the faint sound of whispering drifted out into the hallway. My father hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The room was in disarray, the furniture overturned and the curtains torn. But what caught our attention was the figure standing by the window. It was my mother, her back to us, her head tilted at an unnatural angle as she stared out into the darkness. "Margaret," my father called out, his voice trembling. She didn't respond. Slowly, he approached her, his hand reaching out to touch her shoulder. As soon as he did, she turned to face us. Her eyes were black, void of any color, and her skin was pale and gaunt. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, only a low, guttural moan. My father stumbled back, his face a mask of horror. My mother's body convulsed, her limbs twitching unnaturally as if something else was controlling her. And then she spoke. "William, come to me." It was the same voice I had heard all those years ago, the voice from the woman in the gown. But it was coming from my mother's mouth, her lips moving in sync with the words. I could feel the cold air seeping into the room, the same chill I had felt in the underground chamber. My father grabbed my arm and pulled me out of the room, slamming the door behind us. He locked it and leaned against the door, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "We need to leave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to leave this place." We packed as quickly as we could, my father's hands shaking as he shoved clothes and essentials into bags. The house seemed to come alive with agitation. Doors banged open and shut on their own, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the house itself was trying to keep us from leaving. I could feel the walls closing in on us, the air thick with a palpable sense of malevolence. As we raced down the stairs, the figure of my mother appeared again, standing at the bottom of the staircase, her eyes still hollow and black. She reached out to us, her voice echoing through the house. "William, come to me." My father hesitated for a split second, but then he grabbed my hand and pulled me past her, our hearts pounding in unison. We burst through the front door into the cold night, the house behind us falling silent. The sense of dread that had hung over us seemed to lift as we drove away from Graymoor, leaving the old house behind. For years we tried to move on. We settled in a small town far from the woods, where the air was clear and the nights were quiet. My father found work at a local factory, and my mother slowly recovered, though she was never quite the same. The memories of Graymoor haunted us all, but we tried to live as normal a life as possible. However, the house had a way of following us. No matter where we went, the whispers never stopped. I would hear them in the dead of night, soft and mournful, calling my name. The nightmares continued, though they became less frequent. My mother's health improved, but the dark shadows never truly left her. When I turned 18, I made the decision to return to Graymoor House. My father and mother were adamant that I stay away, but I needed answers. I had to know what had happened to my family, what had happened to the house. It was a decision I made in the dead of night, fueled by a sense of unfinished business and the nagging feeling that there was something I still needed to uncover. I arrived at Graymoor House on a foggy afternoon, the dense mist curling around the twisted trees like ghostly fingers. The mansion loomed in the distance, its once grand facade now a crumbling relic of a bygone era. The windows were boarded up, and the yard was overgrown with weeds and ivy. The air was thick with an oppressive silence that seemed to whisper of long-forgotten sorrows. I pushed open the gate, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. The path to the front door was choked with foliage, but I made my way through the undergrowth and reached the entrance. The door creaked open with a slow, agonizing groan, and I stepped inside. The interior was as I remembered it, dusty, decayed, and eerily silent. The air was cold, and a strange sense of familiarity settled over me, like stepping into a place I had always known. I moved cautiously through the house, my flashlight cutting through the darkness as I made my way to the library. The library was in much worse shape than I had anticipated. The books were scattered, and the shelves were empty or broken. The large desk where my father had spent so many hours was overturned, its contents strewn across the floor. I searched through the mess, trying to find any clue that could explain what had happened. As I sifted through the papers, I found something that caught my eye, an old leather-bound journal hidden beneath a pile of dust-covered books. It was my grandfather's journal, filled with cryptic notes and strange symbols. I flipped through the pages, trying to make sense of the scribbled notes. Most of it was incoherent, but there were occasional passages that stood out. The entity that resides within the house, a malignant spirit bound by dark rituals, the child will awaken it. My blood ran cold as I read the passage. It seemed to describe the very thing that had tormented my family. I continued reading, piecing together fragments of a dark and twisted history. My grandfather had been involved in occult practices, seeking to commune with spirits and harness their power. The experiments he conducted had apparently opened a door to something malevolent, something that had taken hold of the house and its inhabitants. As I read further, I discovered an old hand-drawn map of the house. It showed hidden rooms and secret passages, places I had never explored as a child. According to the map, there was a room in the basement that had been sealed off. It was marked with an ominous symbol, a circle with an eye in the center, surrounded by strange runes. Determined to find this hidden room, I made my way to the basement. The staircase creaked under my weight, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. I reached the bottom and saw the door leading to the hidden room. It was old and rusted, but it was clear that it had not been opened in years. I took a deep breath and forced the door open. It creaked loudly, and I stepped inside. The room was small and bare, with nothing but a stone altar in the center. On the altar lay a collection of old books and strange artifacts. I could feel the oppressive weight of the room, the sense of something ancient and powerful lurking in the shadows. As I examined the artifacts, I noticed a large old book bound in black leather. It was the same book I had seen in the underground chamber years ago. I opened it carefully, and as I began to read, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room. The pages were filled with dark rituals and incantations, detailing how to summon and control spirits. The last page was a detailed account of a ritual gone wrong, where the spirit had been bound to the house and could only be freed by a blood sacrifice. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My grandfather's experiments had unleashed a malevolent spirit that had taken control of the house, feeding off the fear and anguish of its occupants. The spirit had targeted my family, using them to increase its power and maintain its hold over the house. As I read the final passage, the temperature in the room dropped significantly. I could see my breath in the icy air, and the shadows seemed to dance on the walls. The whispers started again, louder and more frantic. They were no longer just whispers, but a cacophony of voices, rising in a crescendo of madness. I turned to leave, but the door to the basement slammed shut behind me. I was trapped. The shadows converged around me, and I could see the ghostly figure of the woman in the gown. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine. She reached out toward me, her icy fingers brushing against my skin. "William, you must stay." I fought the urge to scream, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers grew louder, filling my mind with terrifying visions. I saw my parents' faces, their eyes hollow and empty, their voices calling out to me. The cold was unbearable, and I could feel the weight of the spirit pressing down on me, trying to drag me into its dark embrace. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I grabbed the black book and began to recite the incantations written within its pages. The words came out in a shaky, uneven voice, but I could feel their power. The shadows recoiled, the temperature began to rise, and the whispers turned into angry, frustrated wails. The ghostly figure of the woman howled in rage, her form flickering and wavering. The air crackled with energy, and the room seemed to tremble. I continued to chant, my voice growing stronger with each word. The spirit fought against me, but I could feel its grip loosening, its power waning. Finally, with a final, desperate cry, I finished the incantation. The room exploded with light, and the shadows were pushed back, banished to the corners of the room. The woman's figure dissipated into the air, her wail echoing through the house as she was driven away. The basement was quiet once more, the oppressive darkness lifting. The door creaked open, and I stumbled out into the hallway, my body trembling with exhaustion. I made my way out of the house, the weight of the past finally lifting from my shoulders. As I left Graymore House behind, I knew that the battle was over, but the scars would remain. The house stood silent in the fog, its dark secrets finally revealed. I had faced the darkness and survived, but I knew that Graymore would always be a part of me. The haunting of Graymore House had come to an end, but the echoes of the past would forever linger in the corners of my mind. I had uncovered the truth, faced the darkness, and emerged victorious. But the memories of that night, the whispers, and the cold shadows would remain with me always, a reminder of the house that almost consumed me. And though I had left Graymore behind, I knew that some stories were never truly finished. Some ghosts never truly rested. The day we moved into the house on Oakwood Street is still etched in my mind as vividly as if it happened yesterday. It was the kind of house people dream of, an old Victorian manor with its towering gables and ornate woodwork, sitting majestically at the edge of a dense forest. The house had a history, the realtor said, though she didn't elaborate, and we didn't ask. Emily, my wife, was captivated by its charm, and our son Max couldn't wait to explore its many rooms and corridors. As for me, I was drawn to its promise of a fresh start, a place to leave behind the struggles of the past and build something new. But from the moment we stepped inside, something felt off. It was subtle at first, just a strange stillness that seemed to hang in the air. The light, though it filtered through the large windows, seemed muted, as if the house itself was swallowing it. The floors creaked under our feet, and the walls, lined with faded wallpaper, seemed to close in around us. I dismissed the feeling as nothing more than nerves. Moving is always stressful, and I figured my mind was playing tricks on me. We spent the first few days settling in, unpacking boxes, and getting to know our new home. Max, with his boundless energy, darted from room to room, his laughter filling the empty spaces. Emily busied herself with decorating, carefully arranging our furniture and hanging up photos of our family. The first night, we were all exhausted. The kind of bone-deep fatigue that comes from moving and unpacking left us too tired to do anything but collapse into bed. The house was quiet, save for the occasional groan of the old wood and the distant sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside. I drifted off to sleep almost immediately, my mind heavy with the events of the day. It was around midnight when I first heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. I woke with a start. The room around me plunged into darkness. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I lay there, straining to listen, the whisper grew louder, more distinct. It was like a low murmur, a voice just at the edge of hearing, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving the room in an eerie silence. I glanced over at Emily, who was still fast asleep beside me, oblivious to the sound. I told myself it was just the house settling, the old pipes creaking in the walls, but something about it felt wrong, unnatural. The next morning, I mentioned it to Emily, but she just laughed it off. "It's an old house," she said, shrugging. "They make noises. You're just not used to it yet." I nodded, trying to convince myself that she was right. But the unease I felt wouldn't go away. As the days went by, the whispers became more frequent. They would start late at night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, and they would continue for hours, growing louder and more insistent. Sometimes they seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, other times from the shadows that pooled in the corners of the room. One night, as I lay in bed, I noticed something strange. The shadows on the walls seemed to be moving. At first, I thought it was just the play of the light, the flicker of the old lamp on the bedside table. But as I watched, the shadows began to take shape, twisting and writhing as if they were alive. They stretched and elongated, forming dark, indistinct figures that seemed to dance along the walls. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again, but the figures were still there, moving with a life of their own. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I wanted to wake Emily, to tell her what I was seeing, but I was frozen in place, unable to move or speak. The shadows seemed to be watching me, their movements slow and deliberate, like they were trying to communicate something. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent, and I could almost make out words. but they were in a language I didn't understand, a guttural, ancient tongue that sent chills down my spine. Finally, the shadows faded, melting back into the darkness, and the whispers fell silent. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, my thoughts consumed by what I had seen and heard. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. I tried to go about my day as usual, but the memory of the shadows and the whispers lingered in the back of my mind. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see those dark figures lurking in the corners. Max seemed unaffected by the strange occurrences. He continued to play and explore the house, his laughter echoing through the halls. Emily, too, seemed oblivious to the growing darkness in our home. She was focused on making the house our own, filling it with warmth and love. But I couldn't ignore what was happening. The shadows were getting bolder, their movements more pronounced. The whispers were louder, more coherent, though I still couldn't understand the words. It was as if the house was trying to tell me something important, something I was too afraid to hear. One night, I decided to investigate. I waited until Emily and Max were asleep, and then I grabbed a flashlight and started searching the house. I followed the whispers, moving from room to room, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows seemed to guide me, leading me down the long, winding corridors to the basement. The basement was dark and cold, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and mold. The whispers were louder here, almost deafening, and the shadows danced along the walls, their movements frantic and urgent. I felt a growing sense of dread, but I forced myself to continue. In the far corner of the basement, I found something strange. The floorboards were loose, as if they had been tampered with. I knelt down and pried them up, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside, there was a bundle of old, yellowed papers, tied together with a piece of frayed string. I pulled out the papers and carefully untied the string. The pages were covered in spidery handwriting, barely legible in the dim light. As I read through them, a cold chill ran down my spine. They were letters, written by someone who had lived in the house many years ago. The letters spoke of strange occurrences, much like the ones we were experiencing, whispers in the night, shadows that moved on their own, a growing sense of dread. The letters also mentioned a name, Margaret. The writer of the letters seemed to believe that Margaret was behind the strange happenings in the house. They spoke of her in fearful tones, describing her as a malevolent spirit, trapped in the house, angry and vengeful. As I read the final letter, my hands trembling, I realized that Margaret had once lived in this house, but she had died under mysterious circumstances. The writer believed that her spirit was still here, trapped in the walls, seeking revenge on anyone who dared to live in her home. I dropped the letters, my mind racing. The whispers, the shadows, they weren't just random occurrences. They were Margaret, trying to communicate with us, trying to warn us. But warn us of what? I didn't have time to ponder the question. As I stood there, frozen in fear, the shadows in the basement began to coalesce, forming a dark, towering figure in the center of the room. The figure moved toward me, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, filling my mind with a cacophony of voices. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and fled up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. The whispers followed me, echoing through the house, growing louder and more desperate. I could feel the shadows closing in, their dark tendrils reaching out to me, trying to pull me back. I ran to our bedroom and shook Emily awake. "We have to leave," I said, my voice trembling with fear. "We can't stay here." Emily looked at me, confused and groggy. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "There's something in this house," I said, my words tumbling out in a rush. "Something evil. We have to get out." Emily stared at me for a moment, and I could see the fear growing in her eyes. She nodded, and we quickly gathered Max and packed a few essentials. The whispers were deafening now, filling the house with their incessant chatter. The shadows writhed on the walls, growing darker, more menacing. We ran out of the house, leaving everything behind, and drove away as fast as we could. As we sped down the road, I glanced back at the house. The shadows were there, watching us from the windows, their dark forms barely visible in the dim light. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, the house nothing more than a distant memory. We checked into a motel for the night, but I couldn't sleep. The whispers still echoed in my mind, and every time I closed my eyes I could see the shadows, feel their cold touch on my skin. The next morning I contacted the realtor and told her we wanted to sell the house. She didn't ask any questions, and I didn't offer any explanations. We found a new place to live, far away from Oakwood Street, and tried to move on with our lives. But the experience left a deep scar on all of us. Max stopped talking about the house, but I could see the fear in his eyes whenever someone mentioned it. Emily tried to put on a brave face, but I knew she was just as shaken as I was. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped. The whispers, the shadows, they were still with us, lurking in the corners of my mind, waiting for the right moment to return. Years have passed since that night, but I still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet and the darkness creeps in. I still see the shadows, moving just out of the corner of my eye, waiting, watching. I don't know what really happened in that house or who Margaret was, but I do know this. Some places are better left undisturbed, and some secrets are better left buried. Because once you let the darkness in, it never truly leaves. It lingers, like a shadow, always there, just out of sight, whispering in the dark. And no matter how far you run, no matter how much you try to forget, it's always there, waiting. The forest had always been a dark whisper in our town, a place of shadows, of missing people, of tales told in hushed tones around campfires. But to us, a group of thrill-seeking teenagers, it was an irresistible siren song. We were Ben, the skeptic, Jess, the dreamer, Chris, the muscle, and me, Sarah, the reluctant tag-along, drawn in by a perverse sense of loyalty. We started our trek with the bravado of youth, cameras clicking, laughter echoing through the dense canopy. The forest was everything the rumors said, dark, oppressive, with an eerie silence broken only by the snap of a twig or the distant hoot of an owl. The deeper we ventured, the more the sunlight faded, replaced by an unnatural twilight that seemed to seep from the trees themselves. Hours passed, and the initial excitement had waned. A creeping sense of unease had replaced it, a cold dread that gnawed at our insides. The trees began to twist and contort in unnatural shapes, their gnarled branches like skeletal fingers reaching for us. And then there were the sounds, whispers, moans, and a distant guttural growl that sent shivers down our spines. Jess, always the first to believe in the supernatural, started to babble about ancient curses and dark entities. Chris, trying to maintain our courage, scoffed at her theories, but his voice held a tremor. Ben, the skeptic, was unusually quiet, his eyes scanning the undergrowth with a nervous intensity. The sun began its descent, casting long, ominous shadows that danced and writhed like grotesque puppets. A cold wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it a scent of decay and something else, something primal and ancient. And then we saw it, a pair of glowing eyes, deep in the undergrowth. Panic seized us. We stumbled over roots, our flashlights casting dancing beams of light on the forest floor. The eyes moved, and a low growl echoed through the trees. We ran, our hearts pounding in our chests, the sound of our own ragged breaths mingling with the terrifying symphony of the forest. We stumbled upon a small clearing, a patch of moonlight illuminating our terrified faces. We leaned against each other, our bodies trembling, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant growl that seemed to be drawing closer. Then a twig snapped behind us. We whirled around, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. Nothing. Just shadows. But the air was thick with tension, and we knew we weren't alone. A scream ripped through the night, a sound that chilled us to the bone. It was Jess. We spun around, our flashlights searching desperately for her. And then we saw it. A dark, shadowy figure, moving with unnatural speed, its eyes glowing like embers. Terror paralyzed us. We could only watch as the creature closed in on Jess, its inhuman form outlined against the moonlit sky. A scream, a muffled cry, and then silence. Chris was the first to react. He grabbed my hand and pulled me towards the dense undergrowth. Ben followed, his face pale with fear. We ran blindly, our senses overwhelmed by the terror that gripped us. We stumbled and fell, our bodies aching, our lungs burning. But we kept running, driven by a primal instinct for survival. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees forming a dark, impenetrable wall. We stopped, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding like drums. The forest was silent, too silent. There was no sound of pursuit, no growl, no whisper, just the eerie quiet that preceded a storm. We huddled together, our bodies trembling, our minds racing. We had escaped, but at what cost? Jess was gone, and whatever had taken her was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. The first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, casting long, eerie shadows. As the sun rose higher, the forest seemed to lose its menacing aura. But we knew it was an illusion. The darkness was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for its next victim. And we were survivors, but we were also changed. The forest had marked us, leaving an indelible scar on our souls. We would never be the same. We turned to leave, our steps hesitant, our gazes lingering on the forest. As we walked away, we glanced back one last time. The trees seemed to watch us, their gnarled branches like accusing fingers. And in that moment, we knew that the forest was not done with us. The days that followed were a blur of fear and denial. We existed in a bubble of shared trauma, our laughter replaced by nervous glances and hushed whispers. The forest, once a place of adventure, was now a monstrous entity, its shadows crawling into our dreams. Ben, the skeptic, was the first to crack. His eyes held a haunted look, and his once confident voice was reduced to a trembling whisper. He talked about seeing Jess, her face pale and distorted, calling to him from the depths of the woods. Chris, the strong one, was a shadow of his former self. His muscles tensed at every sudden noise, and his hands were always clenched into fists. As for me, Sarah, I found myself drawn to the forest, like a moth to a flame. There was a morbid fascination, a desperate need to understand what had happened to Jess. I would wander alone, my footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The trees seemed to watch me, their gnarled faces twisted into grotesque masks. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in an ominous hue, I found myself drawn to the spot where we had last seen Jess. The memory of her scream still echoed in my mind, a haunting melody that refused to fade. As I stood there, a strange calm washed over me. It was as if the forest was inviting me in, promising answers. With a mix of fear and determination, I stepped into the woods. The deeper I ventured, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwining to form a claustrophobic canopy. The undergrowth was thick and tangled and strange. Otherworldly sounds filled the air. Then I saw it. A faint light, emanating from the heart of the forest. Curiosity, mixed with a healthy dose of terror, propelled me forward. The light grew brighter, illuminating a hidden clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a colossal, ancient tree, its bark etched with strange symbols, and at its base, a dark, gaping hole. A cold dread washed over me. I knew what I had to do. I took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness. The descent was terrifying. The walls of the hole were slick with moisture, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. I could hear strange, echoing sounds like the whispers of countless voices. Suddenly, I felt a tugging sensation, as if something was pulling me down. I tried to resist, but it was futile. I was falling into an abyss of darkness. Then I landed with a thud. I opened my eyes and my breath caught in my throat. I was in a vast, underground cavern, illuminated by an eerie, ethereal glow. And in the center of the cavern stood a figure, tall and imposing, with eyes that glowed like molten gold. It was then that I realized the truth. The forest was not just a place, it was a being, an ancient, malevolent entity that had been feeding on the fear and despair of those who ventured into its depths. And I, foolishly, had walked straight into its lair. As the creature turned its gaze on me, I felt a wave of terror unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was as if my soul was being ripped apart. And then, darkness enveloped me. I woke to a cacophony of echoes, the sound of my own heartbeat amplified into a deafening drumbeat. My vision was a swirling vortex of darkness, punctuated by flashes of grotesque imagery. The creature, a towering, shadowy figure with eyes that burned like hellfire, loomed over me. Its form was indistinct, yet its malevolence was palpable. I tried to scream, to fight, but my body was paralyzed by terror. The creature reached out, its skeletal hand hovering inches from my face. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the inevitable. Then, a strange thing happened. A voice, soft yet insistent, echoed in my mind. It was a woman's voice, filled with a wisdom that transcended time. "You are not alone," she said. "You have a choice." The voice seemed to emanate from within me, a spark of defiance ignited in the depths of my despair. I opened my eyes, meeting the creature's gaze with a newfound resolve. In that moment, I realized I was not just a victim, but a survivor. With a surge of adrenaline, I pushed myself to my feet. The creature lunged, but I dodged its attack, the voice's guidance propelling me into action. I fought with a ferocity that surprised even myself, my hands finding weak points in the creature's shadowy form. The cavern erupted into chaos. The echoes of our struggle reverberated through the underground chamber, a symphony of horror and defiance. The creature howled in frustration, its attacks growing more desperate. With a final, Herculean effort, I managed to land a blow that sent the creature reeling. It staggered back, its form flickering and fading. Then, with a final, mournful wail, it vanished, leaving behind an eerie silence. Exhausted and trembling, I collapsed to the ground. The cavern was still. The only sound, the echoing of my ragged breaths. Cautiously, I stood up and looked around. The ethereal glow had faded, leaving the cavern in complete darkness. I fumbled for my phone, hoping against hope that it would work. To my astonishment, it lit up, a weak beam cutting through the darkness. With trembling hands, I dialed 911, my voice a hoarse whisper. As I waited for help to arrive, I looked around the cavern. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the air was thick with an otherworldly energy. I knew I had to get out of there, but a part of me also felt a strange pull, as if the cavern held secrets that needed to be uncovered. The sound of sirens echoed through the cavern, breaking the silence. Hope surged through me as I realized that rescue was near. I turned to face the exit, ready to embrace the world above. But as I did, I glanced back at the cavern one last time. And in that moment, I saw it. A faint, shimmering light, emanating from the depths of the darkness. It was a light filled with both promise and peril, a beacon calling me deeper into the unknown. And as the sound of sirens grew louder, I made a decision that would change my life forever. The siren's wail echoed through the cavern, growing louder with each passing second. It was a sound of rescue, of deliverance. Yet as I stood at the precipice of escape, a strange pull drew me back to the heart of the darkness. The light, that ethereal glow, pulsed with an alluring intensity. It was a siren song, promising knowledge, power, perhaps even redemption. I hesitated, torn between the safety of the world above and the unknown depths below. With a heavy heart, I turned away from the siren's call. I had faced the darkness, conquered my fear, and survived. That was enough for now. I would return, but not yet. There was time. As I stepped into the growing light cast by the approaching rescue team, I glanced back one last time. The cavern seemed to sigh, as if disappointed. The light pulsed, fading slowly until it was gone. I was pulled towards the exit, the world above a stark contrast to the subterranean realm I had just escaped. The fresh air was invigorating, and the sunlight felt warm on my skin. Yet as I was carried out on a stretcher, my mind was already racing, planning my return. The forest had changed me irrevocably. I was no longer the same person who had ventured into its depths with a group of friends. I had faced a horror beyond comprehension and emerged with a strength I never knew I possessed. The days that followed were a blur of medical examinations and therapy sessions. My friends, Ben and Chris, were by my side, their faces etched with worry. They listened patiently to my tale, their skepticism gradually replaced by a grudging acceptance of the impossible. As I recovered physically, I began to delve deeper into the mystery of the forest. I spent countless hours in the library, poring over old books and maps, searching for any mention of the underground cavern or the creature that guarded it. My research led me to a forgotten legend, a tale of an ancient evil that had been imprisoned beneath the forest for centuries. The legend spoke of a chosen one, a person with the courage to confront the darkness and break its hold on the world. Could I be that chosen one? The thought was terrifying, yet exhilarating. I felt a strange connection to the forest, a bond forged in fire and fear. As weeks turned into months, my physical wounds healed, but the scars on my soul remained. The forest was a constant presence in my thoughts, a haunting melody that refused to fade. I knew I would return one day, drawn back to the darkness by a force beyond my control. Until then, I would prepare myself. I would study the ancient texts, train my body and mind, and face my fears head-on. For the battle was far from over. The forest was waiting, and so was the darkness. My name is Adam, and this is a story I've never shared with anyone before. It happened 5 years ago, in the summer of 2019. I was 28 at the time, living in Portland, Oregon, and I considered myself an experienced hiker. I'd been through countless trails, camped in the wild for days on end, and I thought I knew the wilderness like the back of my hand. But there's something about that particular hike, deep in the Oregon wilderness, that still haunts me to this day. It was supposed to be a solo trip, just a weekend to clear my head, but what I encountered out there was beyond anything I could have imagined. I had been planning the trip for weeks. I chose a less traveled path in the Mount Hood National Forest, a trail I had never hiked before. The area was known for its dense woods, towering trees, and remote location, perfect for someone looking to get away from civilization for a couple of days. The first day was uneventful. The trail was rough, but nothing I couldn't handle. The forest was beautiful, with the late afternoon sun filtering through the leaves, casting golden light on the moss-covered ground. I set up camp near a small stream, made a fire, and settled in for the night. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The kind of quiet that makes you aware of how alone you really are. As the night grew darker, the woods seemed to close in around me. The trees cast long, twisted shadows, and the sounds of nocturnal creatures echoed in the distance. I shrugged it off as my mind playing tricks on me and crawled into my tent, determined to get some sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. My heart raced as I lay still, listening intently. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, crunching softly on the forest floor. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the darkness. Nothing. just trees and shadows. I convinced myself it was an animal, a deer maybe. I tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through me. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. The next morning, I found footprints near my tent. They were human, but larger than any I'd ever seen. The prints were deep, like whoever or whatever had made them was incredibly heavy. A chill ran down my spine, but I pushed the fear aside. I was deep in the woods. It could have been another hiker. Still, the rational part of me knew that the trail was rarely used, especially this far in. It didn't make sense, but I wasn't about to let some weird footprints ruin my trip. I packed up my gear and continued along the trail, but the unease stayed with me. The forest seemed darker that day, the trees closer together, their branches intertwining overhead like skeletal fingers. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every so often I'd hear a twig snap or the rustle of leaves behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. I needed to find a place to set up camp, but the terrain was getting rougher, the trail harder to follow. That's when I stumbled upon the cabin. It was hidden deep in the woods, barely visible through the thick undergrowth. The structure was old, with weathered wood and a sagging roof. The windows were broken, and the door hung off its hinges. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Part of me wanted to turn back, to find another spot to camp, but the sun was setting, and I didn't have the energy to keep going. Reluctantly, I decided to spend the night in the cabin. I figured it would be better than sleeping in the open with whatever was out there. The inside of the cabin was even creepier than the outside. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the floor was littered with debris. I set up my sleeping bag in the corner, away from the broken windows, and tried to ignore the unsettling atmosphere. As night fell, the wind picked up, howling through the gaps in the walls. The cabin creaked and groaned as if it were alive, straining against the wind. I tried to sleep, but every noise set me on edge. I felt vulnerable, exposed. The sense of being watched had returned, stronger than before. Then I heard it, the whispering. At first it was faint, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of leaves. But as the minutes passed, it grew louder, more distinct. The voices were low and guttural, speaking in a language I didn't understand. They seemed to be coming from all around me, echoing off the walls of the cabin. I sat up, clutching my flashlight, and scanned the room. There was no one there, but the voices continued, a cacophony of unintelligible murmurs. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Was it the wind? My imagination? Or was there something more sinister at play? I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my gear and bolted out of the cabin, into the darkness of the woods. The voices followed me, growing louder, more urgent. It felt like they were inside my head, whispering directly into my mind. I ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. The voices were deafening now, a chorus of madness that drowned out all rational thought. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I had to get away. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I stumbled into a clearing and collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The voices had stopped, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. The moon was high in the sky, casting a pale light over the clearing. I was alone, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left me. As I lay there trying to catch my breath, I noticed something in the center of the clearing, a stone circle partially buried in the earth. It looked ancient, worn smooth by time. In the middle of the circle was a single large stone, standing upright like a monolith. I felt drawn to it, compelled to approach. As I got closer, I saw that the stone was covered in strange symbols, etched deeply into its surface. The same symbols I had seen carved into the walls of the cabin. Suddenly, the whispers returned, but this time they were clear, almost coherent. They were urging me to touch the stone, to complete some kind of ritual. I could feel the energy emanating from the stone, a dark, malevolent force that seemed to pulse with life. Every instinct told me to run, to get as far away from that place as possible, but I couldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed, my body no longer under my control. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel my hand reaching out toward the stone. The moment my fingers brushed the surface, a wave of cold swept through me. It was as if the life was being drained from my body, replaced by something ancient and evil. The voices were inside me now, a cacophony of screams and whispers that filled my mind with unbearable pain. I tried to pull away, but I was trapped, rooted to the spot by some unseen force. Images flashed before my eyes, visions of rituals, sacrifices, and unspeakable horrors that had taken place in that very clearing. I could see the faces of those who had come before me, their eyes hollow, their souls consumed by the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I was on the ground, gasping for air, the stone circle looming over me like a sentinel. The voices were gone, replaced by an overwhelming silence. I could move again, but I felt weak, drained, as if a part of me had been taken away. I don't know how I found the strength to get up, to leave that place, but I did. I stumbled back through the forest, my mind a haze of fear and confusion. The trees seemed to close in around me, the shadows darker and more oppressive than before. I don't remember much of the journey back. It's all a blur of twisted branches, dark paths, and the overwhelming need to escape. By the time I reached civilization, I was barely coherent, a shell of the person I had been just days before. I never spoke of what happened in those woods. I tried to forget, to push the memories down into the depths of my mind where they couldn't reach me. But they never really went away. The whispers still come to me in the dead of night, a reminder of what I encountered out there. I haven't been hiking since. The woods, once a place of solace and peace, are now tainted with the memory of that night. I've tried to move on, to live a normal life, but there's a part of me that knows the darkness is still out there, waiting. And sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees or the night is too quiet, I can still hear the whispers, calling me back to the woods. But I'll never go back. Not after what I saw. Not after what I felt. The wilderness holds secrets, ancient and terrifying, and some things are better left undisturbed. When I'm 16 years old, and the story I'm about to tell is something that I'll never forget. It took place on August 24th. School had been in session for about 2 weeks, so to unwind, I decided to see if my friends Leo and Max wanted to play Fortnite. My mom and sister were out shopping, and my dad was working, so I was feeling pretty bored. It was around 8 p.m. when we finally got online to play. After a few rounds, I could tell my friends were getting frustrated with losing. So they logged off after about an hour. I planned on just lying down with my phone before going to bed. That was until I heard my 2 dogs barking outside. It's not unusual for them to bark, since people walk by on the road outside our front yard, but I still checked. Better to be safe these days. I didn't see anyone out there, but right after I looked out the window, I heard our garage door open and close. That usually meant my dad was home from work. However, I thought it was odd because I didn't see his van outside, and he had texted me earlier saying he'd be working late. I decided to walk downstairs into the dining room to get a better look. From there, I could see that the driveway was empty. At first, I thought, oh no, could it be a ghost? For context, someone had died on our property many years ago when it used to be a gas station. Apparently, an old man put too much air into his tire, and it exploded. Now, I'm not the type to go investigating strange noises in the night, so I ran back up to my bedroom and texted my family group chat to ask if anybody was home. I told my mom about the garage door, and she told me to turn off all the lights, lock my bedroom door, and stay in there until she got home. So I did just that. About 15 minutes later, I thought I heard the wooden floorboards downstairs creaking, like someone was trying to sneak around. I didn't have anything to use as a weapon, so I unclipped my microphone's boom arm from my desk and quietly opened my door. I walked onto the upstairs balcony and looked over, trying to see if I could spot anyone hiding or anything suspicious. I then stupidly called out, "Is anyone there?" as if somebody was actually going to answer me. For a moment, I thought I was just being paranoid until I saw the silhouette of someone standing beneath the balcony. I panicked and ran to the closest room, which happened to be the small bathroom beside my room. The intruder must have known I saw him because I heard loud footsteps coming up our stairs as I locked myself in. I was cursing under my breath that I had accidentally left my phone in my bedroom. After hearing nothing for several minutes, I finally built up enough courage and bolted out of the bathroom into my bedroom, locking the door as soon as I got in. My sister's room was right across from mine, and I noticed that her door was open, so I figured that's where the intruder must have gone. After locking myself in my bedroom, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but just before I hit the call button, I noticed that the door to the storage room was slightly ajar. I then saw an eyeball peeking through the crevice. That's when it hit me. The intruder was not in my sister's room. He was here with me. The terror I felt rushing through my body is something I will never forget. True, genuine fear. I ran out of the bedroom and booked it down the stairs and out my front door. I then ran up the hill to my neighbor's house, who happened to be a police officer. I told him about the intruder hiding in my bedroom, and he immediately alerted the police. Then he set out to investigate himself, while I stayed behind with his wife. Minutes later, I ran back down to see if the intruder had been caught. When I entered my house, I saw a tall, skinny man I had never seen before. He had a gray beard and a dirty black coat. He was on the ground being handcuffed by my neighbor. Ever since that night, I'm no longer allowed to be home alone anymore, and we have upgraded our security around the house. Now, my family is just happy that I wasn't hurt and is very thankful for my neighbor's bravery. I don't wish an experience like this on anyone, not even my worst enemy.